A couple of weeks ago we repaired the floppy drive in an Amiga 1200. Towards the end of that video though, we took a look at the motherboard, this motherboard, to have a look at the capacitors on it. We came to the decision that those capacitors need to be changed. There is one that definitely looks as if it has leaked, and if one has leaked, as we all well know on these boards, it's only a matter of time before they all leak. So best to do it now. I asked the question if it was something you would like to see a video on. The overwhelming response to that was yes. So let's get stuck in and get those capacitors changed. And if we're going to change capacitors, well, we obviously need to get all these old ones off. There are multiple ways to do it, and this is certainly one of them. So just grab the capacitor in my pair of snips and pull as hard as possible. And that's all well and good when you need to remove capacitors from a scrap board such as this one out of an old PlayStation. But on our Amiga, we'll be using a slightly more gentle approach. We're going to be using hot air to remove all the old surface mount caps. To remove the through hole stuff, we'll just use the desoldering station. But before we jump in with this thing, we need to mask off the area around each cap with some high temperature masking tape. And that's just to ensure that none of the other surface mount components around here, that none of them get moved. Or, in fact, that we don't melt the likes of this plastic connector or any of the other plastic bits on the board. So the easiest two to do on camera is probably these two here. These are on the audio section of the Amiga. But as I said, there's quite a few surface mount components around that. We don't want those to move, so let's protect them with some of this stuff. Now typically one layer of our masking tape there would be enough to protect everything. But given the fact that this stuff is really cheap and this board is really expensive, I'm going to put 2 layers on just to be sure. But we're not going to jump in with the hot air gun just yet. Rather, I want to apply a little bit of fresh solder to the 4 points here around these capacitors. And my reasoning for doing that is that just with the age of the solder that's on here, and just in case there would be any corrosion having leaked here, that little bit of fresh solder will just help to get the heat into what's there and just make it that wee bit easier for the hot air to melt it and get these old ones off the board. And yes, that's a complete mess, but it doesn't really matter because all we were doing that for is to aid getting these off. So I have the hot air gun set to 360, the airspeed is set to maximum, and let's just heat this up. The thing to remember is to keep the gun moving at all times. This is definitely the safer way of doing it, rather than just ripping the caps off the board. But if you hold the heat in one location for too long, you can risk delaminating the board and damaging it that way. So 2 capacitors removed without any force applied to the PCB whatsoever. We do have a couple of blobs of solder to deal with though. That's where this wick comes in. And we're not applying any real pressure through this wick onto the board. Rather, we're just allowing the iron to heat it, to melt the solder. And we're just basically letting it float across the top of the board. So you can see we have 4 pads there, almost ready to accept the new capacitors. The last thing it needs though is just a little bit of IPA on a cotton bud. And we're just going to give it a little clean. There, you wouldn't even know there was capacitors fitted there in the first place. So both of those were 22 UF. There's the 2 new ones. I'm going to put some flux down on the board. And the way I like to fit the new ones anyway is to pre-tin one of the pads. We can then grab the new capacitor in the tweezers. And I should have done this the other way around because I'm left-handed and now I have to do soldering with my right hand. There's a fair chance I'll need to tidy this up in a minute. But if you look at the bottom of the capacitor, you see the shape of that. Well, there's a corresponding outline on the board. There's a chamfered edge at this side here. That's the positive edge of the cap. The base of this is chamfered as well. And the negative side is denoted by that solid black bar. But the way I like to fit these is just to pre-tin that one. Then we can go in with the iron, melt that solder again, and just offer that one up. And then with that side down, that'll hold the capacitors in place. Just going to put some solder on the tip of the iron. Just hold the capacitor down with my finger and flow the other side. And that's pretty much it. 2 done. Quite a few more yet to go. So we've done those 2. I've since done those 2. And the next ones I want to tackle are those 2 there. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, and in particular for this one, there isn't a lot of room to work. The solder points are on those sides there, and certainly on this side it is very close to the keyboard connector. So the easiest thing to do to avoid any potential damage to this, since this is made of plastic after all, is to remove it. So that's the underside of it there, and those legs sticking through. Luckily enough, none of the traces running to that are overly thick. When it comes to removing some of the through-hole capacitors later, well, we are going to struggle because some of them go through onto really thick ground planes on this side. But this keyboard connector should be simple enough. We are going to put a little bit of fresh solder on there though as well, just to help getting the heat to flow. And so with that out of the way, just makes access to those 2 caps all the more easier. Now the other side of them is still fairly close to a lot of plastic on the audio jacks, the RGB port and the parallel port, but we'll just try and be careful around those. So same again, just a couple of layers of our high temperature masking tape, and then we can go at it with the hot air. So I think this time I'm going to put a little flux on these before desoldering as well. I really want these to come off as quickly as possible. And I'm still going to go in with a bit of fresh solder too. Don't even know if I can get to the back of that one with the fresh solder. You know, I may yet remove the RGB and the parallel port. The only reason I don't really want to be honest, is what I was saying earlier. They go through onto massive ground planes on the other side, and getting them off can be a bit of a nightmare. Let's just see how we get on though. Okay, they're off. But did we get away with it? on the ports. Hopefully I didn't melt anything. Just going to give everything a second to cool down, and then we'll peel back our tape just to check. So while I was waiting for that, I just cleaned up those pads. They're ready to put the new caps on, but let's peel all this back and see if we damaged anything. Hopefully not. But yeah, didn't I do quite the number on that? Oh my goodness. Well, that is very much lesson learnt there. I have melted all 4 of those. Looks like they need to come off. And it looks like I need to buy some new connectors. So yeah, that is what I always should have done, isn't it? This gives us so much more access to those 2 capacitor positions. Even though in this instance it is costing me 2 ports and 2 audio jacks. But look, lesson learned. I could very easily have glossed over that with a bit of creative editing. But sure, if I was to do that, then nobody else would be able to learn from my mistakes. So 2 more 22 UF caps. Same again, just tin up 1 pad. Then use the tweezers to position the new capacitor. And just do the other side. I blocked a hole there for the keyboard connector. But hopefully a little bit of wick should suck that back up. Nope, I'll have to get the desoldering station back out to clear that. That makes short work of that. But I may as well leave the desoldering station out, because the next caps that we need to do are these ones here. And just like the previous, we do have plastic things in their vicinity. That being the IDE header and the PCMCIA port. So definitely don't want to make any more silly mistakes. I'm just going to remove those. That'll give us better access to replace these caps. Well, that certainly gives us a lot more space to work here without any risk of causing any more damage. That said though, to get to a couple of these caps, this one in here in particular, those 2 through-hole caps, well, they're in the way. So while the desoldering station is still going, sounds like a good time to get those out. So one of them sits at those 2 solder points there. Another one is there. And the other one up in this area sits between those 2 points. There is another one down the other end of the board as well. But let's get those 3 out first. I've turned the temperature of this up ever so slightly. It's up to 370 now, and that's just to try and deal with this massive ground plane here. This is going to absorb an awful lot of heat. A little bit of fresh solder again, that just helps. Hold that on for a second. And yeah, that side cleared okay. It's this side here that I think is going to prove difficult. And as I thought, that hasn't cleared whatsoever. So I think the only way I'm going to be able to get this, to be honest, I've got the board propped up here. There's the cap there that we're trying to remove. So I'm just going to grab that, heat it on this side, and try to gently pull it through. And even at that, I can't get it. Come on. That's it out now. Just needed to add that little bit of solder to it there. That just helped get the heat down into the hole. Do the same on the other side. and we have one capacitor removed. This thing then should be able to clear those holes now without too much difficulty. Eventually got all 4 of them out, and I fitted new caps in those positions. I'll leave fitting the new through-hole ones there until we get the surface mounted stuff finished. You can see I have taped this off, ready to go. No more plastic in the area, so nothing to worry about from that perspective. The only thing that will be slightly concerning is the pads around this capacitor. If you compare the pad at the front of that to either of those ones beside it, well, that one is definitely dull. In fact, it almost looks a bit green. So I'm just going to take one extra step with this cap. Using the fiberglass pen, I'm just going to go over the front of that very gently. That just gets the very surface corrosion off it, and hopefully we can flow some fresh solder onto it, and the hot air gun will do the rest. As you can see though, that is not really taking to it. A bit of flux might help. Right, I think I have some fresh solder mixed in with that. Let's just see how we get on with the hot air gun. And luckily enough, that one came off without any problems whatsoever. Hopefully the rest of these come off just as simply. So yes, they all came off fine. Let's go over the pads now to clean them up. Of course, the next problem then is trying to remember which capacitor went where. That's where Amiga PCB Explorer comes in handy. So say for the cap at that position there, if we look that up on PCB Explorer, well, there it is there. And if we hover over the positive side of it, that is an electrolytic 47UF. And that's one of those right there. And then it's just the same story again. Well, that's it. One Amiga 1200, fully recapped. Just need to put it back in the case and see if it still works. Well, it's all back in its case. I don't have the top RF shield on though, and there only is the one screw holding it together for now. But the CF card is back in, as is the SRAM card that the guy who owns this uses for an extra 2 megabytes of memory. It's got a problem though, and it's one of those intermittent things. Let's see if it does it this time. So it powers up okay. It starts to boot to the CF card. That's fine. And it's crashed. And that's what it's been doing on me. The thing is though, I have absolutely no idea why. If I remove the SRAM card and try it again, well, there's another crash. This time a software failure. See that error code 8002, 8001? I can't find anything exact online about it, but it seems to suggest that it might be an issue with the ROMs. It reset itself there and has made it into Workbench this time. But with only 755,000 bytes of graphics memory free, well, there's not a lot you can really do with it. So I thought maybe there's a problem with this, but I've tested this in my 1200 and it seems to be fine. Equally, if I put this in and run Amiga Test Kit and run a memory test, well, I let that do 10 full loops and it's fine. So, any ideas? If I swap out to my 3.1 ROMs, it now boots okay. And we can even make it do something. So do we have a problem in a kickstart ROM? But if that was the case, if one or both of those has an issue, why does this machine boot okay if I remove this SRAM card? The only way I can get it to boot and to stay stable with the SRAM card in there is to use my 3.1 ROMs. So some further investigation and look what I spot. Resistor E113R on the underside of the board. That almost looks to me as if something there has been knocked off. Now I've hunted around the place here, and yes, okay, it is really small, but I can't find anything, certainly not lying on my blue mat. But has something got knocked off here somewhere down the line, and could that be causing our problem? Looking at the PCB Explorer again, that's meant to be a 68 ohm resistor. I don't have a surface mounted part that would do it, but certainly to test this theory, I could just fit this through hole part, just make that off onto those pads. And I suppose since we're down here, I may as well do the timing fixes, because just looking over here beside it, well, it's recommended that capacitor 123 and 125, that those two are removed. They're still here on this board, so we may as well pull them off while we're at it. Well, after doing that, it's been sitting on the bench here rather curiously, but it's been running for at least 2 hours now and no crashes. It's working fine. So, dare I say, is it fixed? Question remains though, was the problem that missing resistor? Or perhaps doing the timing fixes to the board, perhaps that was enough to fix it? Because I discovered something quite interesting about these SRAM cards. Something I'm sure all of you know, but I didn't. If we boot into sysinfo, now what normally happens on any Amiga when you add some fast RAM, the Amiga gets a bit faster. Well, in this instance, you can see there that with our additional 2 megabytes of fast RAM on that SRAM card, our Amiga 1200 is running quite a bit slower. And that's because this is a 16-bit card integrated into a 32-bit computer. So the CPU has to introduce wait states in order to read and write from this. All in all, in my opinion, making this thing here a bit useless, to be honest. But one theory, after talking with a couple of guys on Discord, is that with this in here and the Amiga running slower than it should, could that be causing timing problems, which themselves were causing the Amiga to crash, and me doing the timing fix mod on the bottom of this, has that been enough to correct the problem? Ultimately, I suppose we will never know, but I'm happy enough to call it fixed, so let's put it back in the case, and I can finally get this Amiga 1200 back to its rightful owner. Well, it's all back together, and it's still working, probably going on for 4 hours now. I left this running while going to have a bit of dinner, and it's still going strong. So I'm happy to call it fixed. Just one last thing to do. Let's put a sticker in it, just so that the next person who opens it, well, they'll know that it has been recapped. And I think what I'll do is just stick this to the top of the floppy drive. There we are. That'll do it. Just to put the case screws in, and then this can go back to its rightful home. So just one last thing to do to keep a promise to Chris, who runs the 005AGIMA YouTube channel, Amiga 500 but spelled backwards. Although you probably know him better from the This Week in Retro podcast, which he hosts with Dave and what do you call that other guy? Neil, that's who it is. Well, I told Chris that I would test the capacitors that came out of the floppy drive from this machine, but I thought while we're doing that, why not just test all of these capacitors, and let's see out of all of these how many are good and how many are bad. This is my multi-function tester. I got this from Amazon only a few weeks ago actually. Cost 20 odd pounds and can test multiple things including capacitors. So let's see how it works. This is one of the ones out of the floppy drive. This was a 22 UF 16 volt cap. So that hooks up like that and we press start. So it reads the capacitance as 23.95. So I dare say that is fine. But look at the V loss and the ESR. 2.7% voltage loss and an ESR of 2.9. Both of those values do seem a little high to me. So I'd be happy enough to call that one bad. Let's see how the rest of these turn out. So while this may not be the most scientifically accurate testing regime ever conducted, my benchmark for whether a capacitor was good, intermediate or bad, well, I set that as the capacitance value must be within 10% of the rated value, the ESR must be less than 2 ohms and the voltage loss must be less than 2%. If the capacitor failed 2 of my tests, well, it would end up in the bad pile. If it failed just 1 of my tests, it would end up in the intermediate pile. And if it passed all 3, well, it would wind up in the good pile. So which pile do you think is which? Good, intermediate and bad. So that may make you think, is there any point in even recapping your Amiga 1200? Because I just did it, and out of the ones from the Amiga, the majority of them were good. Well, do you remember that one capacitor that had leaked? Which pile do you think it sits in? It is sitting in the good pile. It's one of those two, can't remember which, but it was one of the 10 UF capacitors, and both of those are well within spec. Although we definitely seen that one of them had leaked. There was corrosion on the pads around it, and while I didn't mention it at the time, while desoldering it, there was that telltale whiff of fishiness. That's the electrolytic fluid within leaking out. So while these may yet be testing good, it still is, in my opinion, critical that your Amiga 1200, or in fact the 600, CD32 or the 4000, all the models that use these surface mount capacitors, it is critical that if it hasn't been done, it's time to get it recapped. Well, that's it. One Amiga 1200 successfully recapped. Yes, there was a bit of a hiccup in the middle there, wasn't there? I did my best to try and melt a couple of ports. In fact, I didn't try my best. I did melt a couple of ports, but that is lesson well and truly learned. You need to remove those before using the hot air. And while me doing that may make you think I'll just pull the capacitors off the board, well, as you've seen me doing on that PlayStation board at the start, it takes quite a bit of force to remove one that way. That cap on that PlayStation board was onto 2 massive traces and it managed to damage one of them. So in an Amiga with leaking capacitors, potentially weakening the pads that it's sitting on. If you try to pull them off like that, well, you're going to have a lot more work to do than simply swapping capacitors. Let's put it like that. And then there was the little hiccup with why the SRAM module wasn't working. We do seem to have that resolved now. I did find what I thought was a missing resistor on the underside of the board, but I'm not actually sure if it was that or if it was the timing fix which solved the problem. And the reason that I say that E113 resistor, I've since checked in my Amiga 1200, which is also a revision 2B, and that resistor isn't fitted. So while it looked like on this one that the part had been knocked off, it very well may have been, in fact probably was, like that from the factory. Now I have left the resistor in there that we fitted. As for the testing that I've done on this since fitting that, well, it certainly hasn't had any negative effect. But if anyone maybe knows any reason as to why that should be removed, well, please let me know and I will do so. But other than that, the only other thing that I've left to do is to drop Rudolph a text, that's the guy who owns this, and let him know that his 1200 is ready for another 30 years of gaming. So that is it for now. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Why not hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. Still plenty more yet to come here on CRG, and I'll see you next time.